Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. We all hate seeing characters we like die. Everyone hates it. It can be, very cathartic. It can be an important part of storytelling, but nobody really likes it. So, the question I want to tackle today is not so much why you would choose to kill a character if you are a writer, why it is important to story structure to sometimes kill off characters, not what methods are best or worst about doing this, but why an audience dislikes losing a character. In case you're new here, I think that the audience is one of the most important parts of storytelling. A story has to be heard as well as told in order to reach beyond simple practice for the storyteller, or perhaps the storyteller's own satisfaction. Getting your story through to an audience is the core of what a storyteller does. It's not the core of what a writer does. It's not the core of what an artist does, but it is the core of a story. A story is both being told and being heard. A story is a series of ideas or events organized so that people can share them with each other. And when you are sharing ideas with another, you can't tell how effective you have been at that until you gauge their reaction to what you have told them. Now, if we can almost 100% guarantee that there is going to be some kind of negative reaction to a part of a story, we have to understand that negative reaction so that we can build a story that will overcome it. Now, this can be difficult. There's some part of every audience that is going to hate seeing any character die, even though other parts of the audience are going to not care that that particular character died. And as you look at the specifics of why groups of people like or dislike specific characters dying, you can eventually begin to build up some broad rules of thumb. As with all rules in creative endeavor, this is a structure that is good to understand, but not something you have to live and die by. It is important to understand why these things work and don't work so that you can effectively remove them and replace them with other structures if you don't wish to use them. This is a basic part of every creative endeavor that's ever existed. Anyone who has studied art knows that if you want to draw the human figure, it is best to begin by drawing anatomy and then branch out from there. It is best to begin drawing from real life and then begin developing unreality in your drawings. It is very easy to add embellishments or quirks of style to something grounded in reality. It is very hard to start from something that is not grounded in reality at all and achieve anything remotely resembling reality. In fact, there will be many errors that you will simply cement into your art style that are very hard to work out if you are trying to become more realistic. There's certainly a huge discussion to be had on rules of thumb or rules of structure in any kind of artistic endeavor and how necessary they are and what it means to know and understand them so that you can take them out of play. Maybe I'll do a video on that at some point in the future, but it's not really my intention to get too deeply into that here. Right now, I want to think about why audiences object to character death so that we are more ready to present character death if it becomes necessary in our story in ways that the audience will resonate with rather than be turned off by. That brings us back to our original question. Why do audiences dislike it when characters die? There are basically a handful of reasons. The first and most obvious one is they were really attached to that character. There's nothing wrong with that. Most writers want audiences to get attached to their characters. Even bad guys, you still want the audience to have a certain kind of attachment to. You want them to really, or at least root against them. This emotional connection can work against you, though, when it comes time to kill a character off. If the audience is really attached to that character, then their death may actually lessen their investment in your story, and that's not good. Now, ideally, when a character audiences are highly invested in, is removed from the story, your audience will then develop a shared point of emotional framework with your characters, who should also be feeling the sense of pain and disappointment and loss that anyone feels when they lose someone they know. If that is your goal, it is very important that there be at least a couple of minutes for the audience and your characters to kind of commiserate over this death. Not literally, but at least have a moment to breathe. There's a great example of this being done well and this being done very poorly in the Star Wars franchise. When Obi-Wan Kenobi dies in A New Hope, there is a moment where we see Luke Skywalker sitting at the game table on the Millennium Falcon, just feeling the loss. And Leia comes in and comforts him. And that is a very effective moment because Obi-Wan Kenobi has been the mentor to Luke and a very important touchstone for the audience in understanding what is going on. That moment of quiet really helps the audience and Luke come together and develop a rapport from Obi-Wan's death. Contrast that with the death of Han Solo, which is not done well at all. Sure, the role in the story to establish Kylo Ren as villain, to kind of build him up, to show that he is ruthless even when facing his own father, these are story beats that could be very effective. If they were supported and held up by the narrative preceding them better, I think this would have been a very emotional moment. I'm not really interested in breaking down how the narrative does not necessarily point Kylo towards this end, because there are some errors there, but they're kind of outside the scope of this story. The moment itself is quite well acted and fairly well written in terms of its dialogue. The fake out is pretty good, but afterwards, there isn't a whole lot of sense of mourning from the characters who were really attached to Han. There is a moment of mourning from Rey, who has not known Han very long, and she shares that moment with Leia, who is Han's estranged wife. But other than that, we don't see this moment have a whole lot of impact on, it seems like, anyone in the movie The Force Awakens. We do get a little bit more of one at the end of The Last Jedi, which was nice, but for the purposes of the narrative, is too far removed to really build that kind of shared emotion between the characters and the audience. We don't see Han's oldest friend, Chewbacca, mourning. We don't see him trying to comfort Leia. This would have been a really great moment to build a connection between him and the audience, because he has known Han the longest, and he is the most appropriate, I believe, to share that feeling of mourning and loss with the audience. But we don't get it. So if you want to keep an audience after killing a character, the first thing I would recommend doing is giving them that sense of shared mourning with characters who have a similar emotional connection with the dead character. The second reason I think that audiences dislike character death is because they feel it cuts off potential storylines. They think that, hey, this character isn't around anymore. We can't have stories about this character that we can get invested in. They have no more room to grow, to progress. Even if you go back and you do a prequel story, everybody knows what the end point is going to be, and that feels like a loss. And the important thing to keep in mind here is that people are not upset necessarily about the death. They are upset about the loss of potential. And I'm going to refer back to a video I've already made about the anime and manga series Goblin Slayer, where I talked about how the author there used the death of a character, seemingly a throwaway character at the very beginning of the story, to then shape his story and his character's relations further down the road. The person who died had a very important impact on her friends and relatives that continued to shape and mold the world even though she was dead. And I think that is the way to handle showing your audience that a character still has meaningful potential even though they are dead. Have characters who are still a part of the story memorialize them in some way. Now, this is not a part of the grieving process. I mean, it can be, but it doesn't have to be. It can be something that happens afterwards. It can be something that they are inspired to do in a completely unrelated circumstance by something they shared with the dead character in the past. Look for opportunities to mold your story by the words and actions of a deceased character, and you will inform your audience that this character's potential did not end with their death. To paraphrase Dr. Hirluck from One Piece, a man does not die when he is shot, nor when disease ravages his body, or even when he is poisoned. He dies when he is forgotten. It is your duty as a writer to remind your audience of this by keeping important characters alive through their impact on the world. Now, there's another reason a lot of people will cite as a reason they dislike characters in a story dying, and that's a bit more meta. Many people dislike a character death in a story because they recognize that it is an attempt to manipulate them. I've said before, and I'll say it again, one of the purposes of a storyteller is to manipulate the emotions and thoughts of their audience along a predetermined path without getting caught doing it. Much like a stage magician, you have to pull tricks on your audience and you have to amaze them. And character death is a very easy, cheap way to get an emotional response from your audience. So many writers have used it in such obvious ways that audiences are becoming wise to this. We no longer live in a time period when the only stories you heard were a handful from the same person over and over again. Storytelling is not just done around the campfire in this day and age. People will compare a new story that they hear to all the other stories they have heard in their life, and those comparisons are not always going to be flattering. There's a lot of bad, manipulative storytelling out there, and audiences are savvy to it now. This is the most media-aware generation that has ever existed. The only way to get around this particular objection of the audience is to become more skillful. As stage magicians had their illusions spoiled to audiences through documentaries and quote-unquote turncoat performers, they had to get more inventive, they had to get more skillful, they had to be more creative and better at their craft. And unfortunately, the only way for a storyteller to overcome this particular hurdle is to become a more skillful storyteller. You have to execute on your ideas better. You have to keep your audience more enraptured in your story. You have to make sure they don't notice the trick you're pulling. That's the only way you can get around that kind of objection. You just have to be better and more skillful. Listen, no two audiences are identical. You're not even going to have the same group of people read a second story you put out as a sequel to the first story. Your audience is always going to react differently, and you can get very granular or you can get very broad in looking at it. All of that input, I think, is valuable because it gives you a sense of how well you are conveying the ideas of your story to other people, which is the integral part of telling that story. Even if you are just telling a story to yourself later on, you have to write a story that is strong, convincing, compelling, and clear to them. Look, I have written stories that I cannot parse or make any sense of when I read them again a year later. That's bad storytelling. And I am my own audience there. The more people at the more different times you add to your story, the more complex that situation becomes. And yet, I don't think we can rule out audience response when we attempt to write a story. If we take very broad looks at the audience, we can start to get a sense of how we can respond to the biggest hurdles our stories will have to overcome to reach our audiences. And hopefully I've given you some things you can think about as you face down the daunting prospect of killing off a character without estranging your audience. Anyways, that's all I've got for you today. There's a like button and a subscribe button down below you can use as you see fit. Let me know how you would go about killing off a character in one of your stories in the comments down below, and I will talk to you later.